Welcome everyone to Dr. John Bedker's Leadership Podcast, the podcast focused on leadership. The episode will begin shortly. Thank you so much for tuning in. Enjoy the podcast.
Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Dr. John Bedker Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, John Bedker. Well, happy Ramadan. Happy Lunar New Year. Happy Ash Wednesday. Lots going on in our world. It's a busy time, an important time. So today we're going to talk about what I think is one, if not the most important leadership core competencies. That is communication. An absolutely critical leadership core competency. Maybe the most critical. So I think this is a good time to talk about this. So much going on in the world, our turbulent world, a little bit crazy at times. What people say, how we communicate, how we don't. Critical. So let's focus on this competency, communication. Could mention things like team building or mentoring. Both critical leadership competencies. How about judgment, decision making? Also critical leadership core competencies. But whatever the leadership competency you're seeking to advance, the delivery, the execution occurs with communication. In our troubled world, we need to practice, to develop, and to deliver thoughtful, well-timed, and well-delivered communication. So let's talk about that for just a few minutes. I'll use a couple of axioms on communication that we all can benefit from. I'll use some quotes, famous quotes on communication, and explore their meaning as we discuss this critical leadership core competency. First axiom, you never have a second chance to make a first impression. Now I'll talk about that more in some of the quotes. We'll dovetail back to it, but think about that. Whether your business is large or small, national, international, local, makes no difference. First impressions are important. That involves communication, how you go about doing it. So remember, whatever your circumstance, whatever your position, you never have a second chance to make a first impression. The other axiom I want us to kind of think about as we go through some of these quotes today is this. Be mindful not only of what you say, but how you say it. Again, similarly, your role in leadership, your position, your authority, your voice, anywhere and everywhere, we should be mindful not only of what you say, but how you say it. So let's keep those two axioms in mind as we go through a few of these quotes. And I'll start by sort of macro thinking about communication in general. And as I am wont to do, bring a few analytics in. Here we go. Back in the 60s, psychologist Albert Moranian, he suggested a rule. The rule 7-38-55. Okay, so what does that mean? What's it all about? How does it affect us? Well, he tried to make the case from his studies in the 60s that heightens the non-verbal cues, particularly body language and tone, and how they likely outweigh the more common, more obviously thought about verbal, the words that we use. Well, there's a few misconceptions about this. I'll just say it up front. Is nonverbal is huge and important, but context is also important. It really does matter. So these numbers don't exist rigidly. It isn't that only 7% of the words are important. Not at all. In context, it could be much higher. The point is to be mindful that there are various components of communication, and oftentimes the unspoken words play an important role, perhaps critical. Okay, so be mindful about that. Be mindful that context matters. But do remember that it could be a small percentage, and relatively small, of your words, what you're saying, rather than tone, body language, and other factors, which may have a significant impact on your effectiveness to communicate. Okay, so here we go. Let's begin. Over the years, there have been so many things said about communication. Some of them are funny, some are entertaining, but I think it's important to note that people wouldn't be commenting if they didn't know that it was valuable to understand. Begin by a quote from James Hume. "The art of communication is the language of leadership." Well, of course, that's what this podcast is about, and I like the way he began it. The art. This doesn't follow some formulaic way. There is an art to communication, but it is the language of leadership. Think about that. Again, it will recur throughout about our axioms, right? In particular, you never have a second chance to make a first impression. Think about how you are really communicating from the beginning your language of leadership. Let's go to Rudyard Kipling, author. "Words are, of course, the most powerful drug used by mankind." So think about that, both sides of the coin. In the affirmative, you really can have this positive impact with words. But similarly, because of the power of words, you could have a negative impact as well. Let's get into that business world. I think that's important. It's where most of us live, work, spend our days. Here's the quote from Andrew Grove. "The worse the news, the more effort should go into communicating it." There we go. The worse the news, the more effort should go into communicating it. Because what do we know? We know that we don't have that second chance to make a first impression. If you come off disingenuous, not trustworthy, suspect in any way, perceived or real, you start off at a deficit. And if that news is not great, it is in fact bad, that is not the starting point that you want. You have to be effective from the get-go. Again, you don't have that second chance to make the first impression. If you start off on the negative, a lack of connection with your audience, a lack of empathy and understanding of who they are and what their expectations are. They want someone to tell them the truth. Keep in mind that other axiom. It's not always just what you say, right? It's also how you say it. So, this quote from Andrew Grove, I think, is particularly important for us thinking about leadership as a critical core competency to really grasp. The worse the news, the more effort should go into communicating it. Folks, oftentimes today in our troubled, our turbulent world, our chaotic world, the news is not good. So we need this competency of communication to be really, really spot on. Okay. Because what happens? Here's a quote from Carla Odell. If you don't give people information, they make up something to fill the void. So you hear this all the time, the classic no comment, right? Well, in fact, that is communication. Because if you don't give people information, they'll make up something. Folks, that is not a good strategy from a leadership point of view. That is not good communication. So we want to be mindful, not only of what we say, but what we are not saying, okay? And the way you do it, right? Back to the original formula. Oftentimes the non-verbal cues, that body language, that tone can really communicate. And perhaps in this case, not in a positive way. Okay. Let's talk about that bridge then, because again, if you say nothing, people are going to fill that void. So what do we know about good communication? Well, here's one from Nat Turner. Good communication is the bridge between confusion and clarity. The people come to hear the leader to give them clarity, to give them understanding, because they may be unclear. They may be in a state of confusion. So this good communication, as Nat Turner says, is the bridge between confusion and clarity. Okay. I think we're making some progress here. Snippets, sound bites. But in this day and age, I think those things are particularly effective. We capture them. They resonate with us. They're clean, they're pure, they're simple. Like your communication skills should be as well. Okay. Let's go to Stephen Covey. Covey says, most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. Wow. Think about that. When we talk, are the other people really hearing you? Are they listening? Covey says most people don't listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. They may have a grievance and they want you to just quickly get past your comments so they can air their grievance. Important to understand, folks, what the nature of communication should be. And it should be for a dialogue, a two-way conversation, with each party intently and meaningfully listening to the other. Management world, we often talk about this idea of active listening. And that's the goal here, to actively listen, to hear and understand what the other person is saying. Okay. Well, I talk about this a lot, what's important. I'm going to give a quote from Mark Twain. I like Mark Twain. I love reading his books because when he says things, they just resonate. They make sense, right? Here's Mark Twain. If you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. Now get that about communication. Because conversations may be ongoing. If you're telling the truth, you don't have to remember anything. Just tell the truth. And what do we know and other leadership competencies about trust? Of course, that trust is based upon trustworthy behavior. And that comes from telling the truth. So I think Twain is really onto something here in terms of effective communication, how we should go about being a good communicator. Tell the truth. Give a couple combined here now from Dale Carnegie, sort of a famous name out of the past. Sales were his world. Couple things he said, Dale Carnegie. Talk to someone about themselves and they'll listen for hours. Not meant to be funny. I think it's true. Similarly, Carnegie says, you can make more friends in 2 months by becoming interested in other people than you can in 2 years by trying to get other people interested in you. So, communication. How do we frame that conversation? How do we hope to learn in this dialogue of two people listening to one another? If you have a genuine, authentic, sincere interest in understanding the other person, learning about them, their story, their circumstance, their needs, their goals, their expectations, you will find yourself in a short amount of time with a person who listens to you and they listen both ways. You to them, them to you. Okay. So, talk about this idea of emotions, tone, things that studies from UCLA we started off with show that perhaps the majority of communication is not the words, it is nonverbal. But what you say can have a huge impact. Here's a quote from Nat Hahn. He says, the way you speak to others can offer them joy, happiness, self-confidence, hope, trust, and enlightenment. Mindful speaking is a deep practice. Folks, I think this is worth taking to heart. This is worth some reflection on each of ourselves to think about not just what we say, but how we say it. Remember that axiom I gave from the beginning. It matters not only what you say, but how you say it. And as Hahn is saying here, the way you speak to others can offer them joy, happiness, self-confidence, hope, trust. Think about that in this troubled world we're living in. If we could pass on a feeling to those we're communicating with like that, happiness, self-confidence, hope, trust, if we could do those things, wow, we would be not only advancing communication, but the relationships we have with others. Okay, so I think another good quote connecting to our original axioms. Here's one from Desmond Tutu. Most people know who he is. He said, "My father always used to say, don't raise your voice. Improve your argument." So here we go back to that formula we started with. If we think that tone, for instance, loudness, emphaticness is the key, probably not. You might make people fearful. You might make them suspect. You might cause them to back away. As Desmond Tutu's father said, don't raise your voice. Improve your argument. If a person isn't buying what you're selling, you need to think about how you're selling. You need to think about improving your argument. Okay, so what we have here is a critical leadership core competency, communication. It is absolutely at a time in our world where it could not be more important. We should take time to reflect, to practice, to engage in the art and craft of communication. It is the bridge. It is the way to truth. It is the way to a better world. A critical leadership core competency, communication. Okay, everyone, thanks so much. I hope you're all well. Take care. We will talk soon.
Thank you for tuning in to Dr. John Bedker's Leadership Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please tell your friends, and, of course, please follow our podcast and subscribe. Thank you again for tuning in.